Hi everybody, welcome into my new viewers and welcome back to my Serendipity Subbies. You're watching Colleen C to Serendipity channel and I'm Colleen. Today is October 17th, 2022 and I would like to bring you this day in history. On October 17th, 1931, gangster Al Capone is sentenced to 11 years in prison for tax evasion and fined $80,000, signaling the downfall of one of the most notorious criminals of the 1920s and 30s. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1899 to Italian immigrants. He was expelled from school at the age of 14 and joined a gang and earned his nickname Scarface after being sliced across the cheek during a fight. By the 1920s, Capone had moved to Chicago, where he was soon helping to run crime boss Johnny Torrio's illegal enterprise, which included alcohol smuggling, gambling, and prostitution. Torrio retired in 1925 after an attempt on his life, and Capone, known for his cunning and brutality, was put in charge of the organization. Prohibition, which outlawed the brewing and distribution of alcohol and lasted from 1920 to 1933, proved extremely lucrative for bootleggers and gangsters like Capone, who raked in millions from his underworld activities. Capone was also at the top of the FBI's most wanted list by 1930, but he avoided long stints in jail until 1931 by bribing city officials, intimidating witnesses, and maintaining various hideouts. He became Chicago's crime kingpin by wiping out his competitors through a series of gangland battles and slings, including the infamous St. Valentine's Massacre in 1929, when Capone's men gunned down 7 rivals. This event helped raise Capone's notoriety to a national level. Among Capone's enemies was federal agent Eliot Ness, who led a team of officers known as the Untouchables because they couldn't be corrupted. Ness and his men routinely broke up Capone's bootlegging businesses, but it was tax evasion charges that finally stuck and landed Capone in prison in 1931. Capone began serving his time at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, but amidst accusations that he was manipulating the system and receiving cushy treatment, he was transferred to the maximum security lockup at Alcatraz Island in California's San Francisco Bay. He got out early in 1939 for good behavior after spending his final year in prison in a hospital suffering from syphilis. Plagued by health problems for the rest of his life, Capone died in 1947 at the age of 48 at his home in Palm Island, Florida. And I would like to bring you some more facts about Al Capone. About 8 facts you should know about Al Capone. 1, Al Capone was in a street gang as a child. Now some of these are from the story I just read you, but they're emphasized a little bit more. They go into more detail. Born on January 17th, 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, Alphonse Capone was the 4th of 9 children. His parents, Gabriel, a barber, and Teresa Capone, were immigrants from Angri, Italy, A-N-G-R-I. Capone belonged to a street gang as a boy and dropped out of school in 6th grade, later joining the 5 Points gang in Manhattan and working as a bouncer and a bartender at the Harvard Inn, a Coney Island bar owned by mobster Frankie Yale. In 1918, he married Mary Coughlin May Coughlin, and the couple remained together until Capone's death and had one child, Sonny. By 1920, Capone had moved to Chicago. Some stories claim he went there out of a need to lay low after severely injuring a gang rival member in a fight, while other accounts say Capone was recruited to come to Chicago by Johnny Torrio, a former Brooklyn mobster, then making his mark on organization crime in the Windy City. 2. He hated his famous name. In 1917, Capone's face was slashed during a fight at the Harvard Inn after he insulted a female patron, and her brother retaliated, leaving him with 3 indelible scars. Capone would attempt to shield the scar side of his face in photographs and tried to write them off as war wounds. Although he never served in the military, after achieving prominence as a gangster, Capone was dubbed Scarface by the press, and nickname he intensely disliked. Criminal associates referred to the mob boss as the big fellow, while friends knew him as Storky, a slang term that meant spiffy. 3. Capone's crimes gang raked in as much as $1 million annually. After arriving in Chicago, Capone worked for Torrio, who was part of a criminal network headed by a man named Big Jim Colsilmo. When Colsilmo was killed, possibly as a hit ordered by Torrio and carried out by Capone's former boss, Frankie Yell, Torrio took over as boss and made Capone one of his key aides. In January 1925, Torrio was gunned down outside his Illinois home. After he survived the attack, but left Chicago later that year, choosing 26-year-old Capone as his replacement. Capone expanded the outfit, as he referred to his Underground World organization, and went on to become one of America's leading mobsters. By some estimates, his crime syndicate pulled in around $100 million a year, the largest portion from bootlegging, followed by gambling, prostitution, racketeering, and other illicit activities. A flashy dresser who liked chatting with reporters and became an international celebrity, Capone did not apologize for the way he made his living. He claimed to be doing a public service for Chicagoans, stating, "90% of the people of Cook County drank and gambled, and my offenses has been to flourish them with those amusements." Number 4, he never charged in connection with the St. Valentine's Massacre. On the morning of February 14, 1929, men affiliated with the George Bugs Moran gang were shot to death while lining up against a wall inside a garage in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. The victims included 5 of Moran's criminal associates, along with a mechanic who worked for him and an ophthalmologist who hung around the gang. Morgan himself wasn't there. A group of attackers consisted of at least 4 men, 2 of them dressed as police officers. The crime became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and stunned the nation. Authorities investigated a variety of theories and suspects to little avail. There even was ample public speculation that Capone, a Moran rival, had masterminded the murders, and he was in Florida when they took place. However, he was never charged in the case, which went unsolved. Number 5, Elliot Ness's role. Elliot Ness's role in Capone's downfall was exaggerated. Thanks to federal agent Elliot Ness's bestseller memoirs, The Untouchables, which spurned a television series and movie, he has been credited as the man who took down Capone. In fact, much of the memoirs was embellished by his co-author Oscar Freire. As a prohibition agent, Ness and a small team of men raided illegal breweries and other places linked to Capone's bootlegging operations around Chicago. Because the agents supposedly refused to accept bribes, they were dubbed the Untouchables by the press. Although Ness's work helped lead to Capone's indictment for prohibition violations, the government instead focused on prosecuting the mobster for tax evasion, and his 1931 conviction on those charges is what sent him to prison. Ness went on to serve as Cleveland's director of public safety and made unsuccessful bid for mayor there in 1947. His later years were marred by heavy drinking, and he died at his home in Colliersport, Pennsylvania in 1957, the year The Untouchables was published. Number 6, Capone was convicted for tax fraud, not murder. Although he controlled a crime empire and ordered his hit on a multitude of his enemies, Capone managed to avoid prosecution for years by paying off police and public officials and threatening witnesses. The mob boss finally was slapped with his first criminal conviction in May 1929 after he was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon in Philadelphia. At the time, he was on his way back to Chicago following a summit of organized crime honchos in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and swiftly sentenced to a year in jail. He was freed in March 1930, and a month later, the Chicago Crime Commission released its first ever list of the city's worst criminals. Capone was named public enemy number 1. Meanwhile, on orders from President Herbert Hoover, to nail Capone, the federal government built a case against the crime boss for income tax fraud, and in June 1931, he was indicted on charges of tax evasion. Capone agreed to a plea deal that included recommended prison sentence of 2.5 years. However, the judge in the case refused to accept the deal. Capone withdrew his guilty plea, and the case went to trial. At the start of the highly publicized proceedings, the judge switched out the pool of prospective jurors after learning bribes had been offered in an effort to seat a Capone-friendly jury. In October 1931, the all-male jury, Illinois didn't allow female jurors until 1939. From the gangster guilty of 5 charges, 3 felonies and 2 misdemeanors, for more than 20 counts against him. He was sentenced to 11 years behind bars and fined $50,000. It was the harshest sentence delivered for tax fraud up to that point. Number 7, he was among the earliest federal prisoners at Alcatraz. In May 1932, 33-year-old Capone began his sentence for tax evasion at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. 2 years later, in August 1934, he and a group of fellow inmates were sent by train to California, then transported to the recently opened federal prison penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in the San Francisco Bay. The maximum security prison intended to hold criminals who were especially violent or who had other disciplinary problems had received its first contingent of federal inmates earlier that August. But Capone wasn't a troublemaker. While locked up in Atlanta, he likely was sent to Alcatraz as a way for the government to generate publicity for its tough new facility. While at Alcatraz, Capone, who'd been diagnosed with syphilis during a medical examination at the Atlanta Penitentiary, started showing signs of the disease, including dementia. As his condition worsened, prison doctors treated him with malaria injections in hopes that the fevers caused by malaria would wipe out the syphilis. Instead, the treatment nearly proved fatal for Capone. In January 1939, he was released from Alcatraz and transferred to a federal correction institute at Terminal Island near Los Angeles to serve his 1-year misdemeanor sentence. Number 8, Capone spent his final years out of the public spotlight. Capone was released from prison in November 1939, then underwent several months of treatment for syphilis at a Baltimore hospital. Afterwards, the famous gangster spent much of his time out of the public spotlight, fishing and playing cards at the Palm Island, Florida mansion he owned since 1928. In the 1940s, he became one of the first civilians to receive penicillin for syphilis, although it was too late to cure him. In January 1947, the 48-year-old Capone suffered a stroke, then came down with pneumonia. He died at his Florida home on January 25th. Capone was buried at Chicago's Mount Olivet Cemetery near the graves of his father and one of his brothers. In 1950, Capone's family had the remains of the 3 men moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. I want to thank you for watching today, and remember to stay blessed and stay safe, and remember to smile, because I love you, but more importantly, God loves you. Bye. I'll see you in my next video.